This series of training videos is brought to you by the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency and the Irrigation Training and Research Center of Cal Poly State University San Luis Obispo in order to assist growers with a new Irrigation Allocation Index program. This video contains a quick overview of the different components of the new Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency's Irrigation Allowance Program. The new program includes a revised approach to ETo zones in the GMA, which uses 3 zones rather than the 5 previously used. Salinity is now also accounted for in the calculations for the allowance. We will discuss the overall recommended allowance values and how the values were created with grower input. The new Irrigation Allowance Index Formula will replace the former Irrigation Efficiency calculation. This video will also mention recommendations for the weather stations in the GMA. The new allowance program implements a simple approach to determining crop allowance values. First, there is a single value for each ETo zone that depends on the rainfall that occurred during the previous calendar year. The years will be classified on an annual basis by the GMA as either wet, dry, or typical rainfall years. Dry years are those that have experienced less than 11 inches of rainfall. Wet years are those that have experienced more than 17 inches, and typical years are those that have experienced between 11 and 17 inches. The new irrigation allowance incorporates several different components, including the evapotranspiration of irrigation water for the crop in question. The calculation also includes the irrigation required for salinity management. This means any water that has to be applied in order to keep the salinity levels in the root zone at a reasonable level to grow the crops. The irrigation allowance also takes into account the water needed to overcome a reasonable irrigation system distribution non-uniformity. A reasonable uniformity value in the GMA is about 0.8. Additionally, the allowance includes any water needed for frost protection, which is the water that has to be applied during the winter when the plants don't necessarily need the water to grow, but the water is needed to keep the plants from freezing. This is the equation used to determine the irrigation allowance value. Here you can see a map of the 3 recommended ETo zones for the GMA, indicated by the black lines. What it basically means is there are 3 different weather zones within the GMA that are mainly determined by proximity to the coastline. The first is closest to the ocean. Zone 2 is in the middle, and the third zone is the farthest inland. Growers in Zone 1 will have moisture conditions caused by the marine layer, and these moist conditions will decrease the further inland the fields are located. Zone 3, then, has the driest and hottest climate conditions. This map shows the salinity values within the GMA area. Zone 1 has an average value of about 1.5. Zone 2 has a variation of salinity measurements, with high values up to 1.8 in the Pleasant Valley Basin. Zone 3 also has variations, but has high values up to 1.8 as well. These salinity values are accounted for in the Irrigation Allocation Formula because of the extra water needed for salinity management. Salts must be kept out of the seedbed areas in order for plants to thrive. This is the recommended irrigation allowance table created by ITRC. The left-hand column lists the 24 different crop types found in the GMA. The 3 different ETo zones are also indicated by the colored columns. The Oxnard zone is Zone 1, which is the closest to the ocean. The Camarillo zone is Zone 2, and the Santa Paula zone is Zone 3, which is the furthest inland. Since Zone 3 has the hotter, drier climate, the allocation values are higher than for the crops in Zone 1, which receive more moisture from the marine layer. Water year types are also indicated for each of the 3 ETo zones. So, for example, for an avocado grower in Zone 1 with mature trees, which have about 70% ground cover shading, the irrigation allowance for a typical rainfall year is 3.7 acre-feet per acre, which means 3.7 feet of water. The same crop grown in Zone 3 would have an allowance of 4.5 acre-feet per acre. This takes into account the different climate and salinity conditions between ETo Zones 1 and 3. It is also important to note that despite the allowance values in the tables, for the Las Posas Basin, the GMA board has set a water application limit of 4 acre-feet per acre. If that value is exceeded in that area, a surcharge is assessed by the FCGMA. Please contact the FCGMA for more information. Here you can see the new formula for the Irrigation Allowance Index. This simple formula is a ratio of the applied water to the irrigation allowance. Basically, you want to have values that are less than or equal to 1. Values greater than 1 mean that too much water is being applied to the field. Values less than 1 indicate that the grower is being more efficient than the irrigation allowance values had predicted. As a final step in the process, ITRC recommends that the GMA continue to use the CIMIS stations located in each of the ETo zones. The California Irrigation Management Information System, or CIMIS for short, maintains weather stations throughout the state. Hourly, quality-controlled data from each station is sent to a centralized location once per day and is freely available to the public. Important information to collect from the stations are ETo data and precipitation data, which can be used for rainfall year type selection. The rainfall year type will be determined by GMA and published at the end of each calendar year. County precipitation gauges can also be used as a check. There are quite a few precipitation gauges operated within the GMA. This video has addressed several components of the new Irrigation Allowance Program, including the 3 ETo zones, salinity concerns that are accounted for in the calculations, and the table of recommended allowance values. The new Irrigation Allowance Index Formula was discussed, as well as the use of weather stations within the GMA. This concludes this video for the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency's Irrigation Efficiency Program. Thank you for taking the time to go through the material. If you have any further questions, please contact the staff at the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency.